There's something incredibly comforting about someone bringing you soup when you're sick. It's one of those small gestures that somehow manages to contain an entire world of care within it. I remember lying in bed, tissues scattered around me like sad confetti, feeling absolutely miserable with what I was convinced was the worst cold of the century. My head was pounding, my throat felt like I'd swallowed broken glass, and I had that peculiar kind of fever that makes you simultaneously freezing and burning up. You know the one I mean, where you're under 3 blankets shivering while also somehow sweating through your pajamas. It's truly one of the most undignified states a human being can find themselves in. I hadn't told many people I was sick. There's something about admitting vulnerability that I've always struggled with. Perhaps it's that stubborn independence that makes me think I can handle everything on my own, or maybe it's just not wanting to be a burden. Either way, I'd mentioned it casually to only a couple of friends, downplaying how awful I actually felt with the classic, just a little under the weather, line we all use when we're practically at death's door but don't want to admit it. So when my doorbell rang that afternoon, I was genuinely confused. I wasn't expecting anyone, and in my feverish state, I briefly wondered if I'd hallucinated the sound altogether. But there it was again, a gentle, almost apologetic ring, as if whoever was on the other side knew they might be disturbing me. With superhuman effort that deserved some kind of Olympic medal, I wrapped my blanket around my shoulders like a cape, shuffled to the door, and peered through the peephole. And there he was, Alex, standing on my doorstep, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, holding what looked like a large paper bag in his arms. Alex and I had a complicated relationship. Not quite just friends, definitely not dating, but existing in that strange in-between space that neither of us had been brave enough to define. We'd known each other for about 8 months, having met at a mutual friend's housewarming party where we'd spent the entire evening in the corner talking about everything from our shared love of obscure 80s movies to our equally strong opinions about whether cereal is technically a soup. Since then, we developed the kind of friendship that involved random texts throughout the day and occasional coffee meetups that sometimes felt like they might be dates, but were never explicitly called that. I opened the door, acutely aware that I looked like something that had been dragged backward through a hedge during a rainstorm. My hair was sticking up in directions that defied the laws of physics. My nose was red and raw from constant tissue use, and I was wearing my oldest, most comfortable pajamas, the ones with the cartoon penguins that had seen better days about 5 years ago. "You look terrible," Alex said with a grin that somehow managed to be both teasing and sympathetic at the same time. "Which is exactly why I'm here." He held up the paper bag. "Homemade chicken noodle soup. My grandmother's recipe. She always said it could cure anything from a common cold to a broken heart." Let me explain why this matters so much in that moment. It wasn't just that he'd brought soup, although that alone was touching. It was that he'd made it himself. And not just any soup, but a family recipe, something passed down through generations, something that represented care and tradition and healing. There's something deeply intimate about sharing family recipes, about preparing food with the explicit intention of making someone feel better. It's one of the most fundamental ways humans show love and concern for each other. I stepped aside to let him in, clutching my blanket cape a little tighter around my shoulders, suddenly self-conscious about the state of both myself and my apartment. There were used tissues everywhere, empty tea mugs on every surface, and the general disarray that comes with being too sick to care about tidiness. But Alex didn't seem to notice or mind. He just headed straight for my kitchen like a man on a mission. "You should be in bed," he called over his shoulder as he started unpacking the bag. "I'll heat this up and bring it to you. Do you have any clean bowls?" "Second cabinet on the left," I croaked, my voice sounding like I'd been gargling with gravel. "But you really don't have to do this." "I'm fine, really." Even as I said it, a coughing fit betrayed my attempted bravado. Alex just raised an eyebrow at me. "Right? Totally fine. That's why you sound like you've been smoking 3 packs a day for the last 40 years. Bed. Now. Doctor's orders." "You're not a doctor," I pointed out, but I was already shuffling back toward my bedroom, secretly relieved that someone else was taking charge for a little while. "I've watched 15 seasons of Grey's Anatomy. I'm practically board certified," he called after me, and despite feeling absolutely wretched, I found myself smiling. I climbed back into bed, arranging my pillows so I could sit up, and tried to do a quick scan of my immediate surroundings to clear away the worst of the evidence of my illness. I was stuffing tissues under my pillow when Alex appeared in the doorway, holding a steaming bowl of soup and wearing an expression of mock seriousness. "Your healing elixir, madam," he said with an exaggerated bow that somehow didn't spill a drop of the soup. "Prepared with ancient wisdom and modern microwave technology." The soup smelled incredible, rich and savory with hints of herbs and garlic. Just the aroma alone seemed to clear my sinuses slightly. He set it carefully on my bedside table, then surprised me by sitting down on the edge of the bed. "Aren't you worried you'll catch whatever plague I'm harboring?" I asked, reaching for the soup. He shrugged. "I have the immune system of a god." "Besides," he added with a mischievous glint in his eye, "someone needs to stay and check your temperature. Make sure you're not about to spontaneously combust." There was something in the way he said it, a gentle teasing combined with genuine concern, that made my heart do a little flip that I immediately blamed on my fever. Alex had always had this effect on me, this ability to make me feel simultaneously comfortable and slightly off balance, like standing on the deck of a ship on a calm day, stable, but with the constant reminder that the ground beneath you is capable of shifting at any moment. The soup was perfect, not too salty, with tender chunks of chicken, carrots cut into precise little coins, celery, and noodles that somehow managed to be exactly the right consistency. Each spoonful felt like it was actually healing me from the inside out, warming places that had been cold and achy for days. "This is amazing," I said after a few spoonfuls. "Your grandmother was clearly some kind of culinary wizard." Alex smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and softened his whole face. "She was something else. Came to this country with nothing but a suitcase and a handful of recipes in her head. Built a whole life around feeding people. She always said food was the most direct way to show someone you care about them." "She sounds wonderful," I said, continuing to eat the soup with the single-minded focus of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. "She would have liked you," he said simply, and somehow that felt like one of the nicest compliments I'd ever received. We sat in comfortable silence for a while as I ate, with Alex occasionally getting up to refill my water glass or hand me a tissue when I needed one. There was an easy domesticity to it that should have felt strange given the undefined nature of our relationship, but somehow didn't. When I'd finished about half the bowl, feeling fuller than I had in days, I set it aside and leaned back against my pillows. "Thank you. Really, you didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," he said, and then, with a theatrical flourish, he pressed the back of his hand to my forehead. Still pretty warm. I think we might need to take actual scientific measurements." Before I could protest, he'd produced a thermometer from my bathroom medicine cabinet. "Open up," he instructed, and I found myself complying without argument, too tired and too touched by his care to put up my usual independent front. The thermometer beeped, and he checked it with exaggerated seriousness. 101.2. Not great, but not rush to the emergency room territory either. "How long have you been like this?" 3 days, I admitted. "But today is definitely better than yesterday. And you've just been here alone the whole time?" There was a note of something like hurt in his voice. I shrugged. I didn't want to bother anyone. "It's just a cold." "A pretty bad cold," he corrected. "And it's not bothering people to let them help you when you need it." He hesitated, then added more softly, "Especially people who care about you." There was a weight to those words that hung in the air between us. People who care about you. It was the closest either of us had come to acknowledging that there might be something more than friendship between us. "I'm not very good at that," I confessed, picking at a loose thread on my blanket. "Letting people help. I've always been the one who takes care of things, you know? It feels strange to be on the receiving end." Alex nodded thoughtfully. "I get that. But relationships, all kinds of relationships, need balance. Sometimes you give care, sometimes you receive it. That's how connections get stronger." I looked up at him, struck by the simple wisdom of what he'd said. "When did you get so insightful?" He grinned. "Probably around the same time I mastered my grandmother's soup recipe. Wisdom and chicken stock go hand in hand." That made me laugh, which immediately triggered another coughing fit. Alex handed me my water and waited patiently for it to pass. "Sorry," I wheezed when I could speak again. "Not exactly at my most glamorous right now." "I don't know," he said, tilting his head as if appraising me. "There's something endearing about the whole death-warmed-over aesthetic you've got going on. The red nose really brings out your eyes." I threw a tissue at him, which he dodged easily, laughing. And just like that, The moment of vulnerability passed, and we were back on familiar ground. The teasing, the banter, the comfortable back and forth that had characterized our friendship from the beginning. But something had shifted, too. There was a new layer to our interaction, a depth that hadn't been there before. Seeing someone at their worst, and choosing to stay and care for them anyway. That's a kind of intimacy that can't be manufactured or rushed. As the afternoon wore on, Alex made himself completely at home in my apartment. He washed the dishes that had accumulated in my sink, made me fresh tea, and even found an old deck of cards in my drawer. We played gin rummy on my bed, with him deliberately letting me win a few hands before his competitive nature took over and he trounced me thoroughly. Not fair, I protested after his third consecutive win. My brain is fever-addled. You're taking advantage of an invalid. All's fair in love and cards. He replied with a wink that made my stomach do that flip again. Besides, I'm building up your immunity through the bitter experience of defeat. It's medicinal, really. We talked for hours, about everything and nothing. He told me stories about his grandmother, about growing up as the only boy in a family with 4 sisters, about his first disastrous attempt at making the very soup I'd just eaten. I shared my own childhood memories, the time I broke my arm falling out of a tree, how I'd always wanted to learn to play the piano but never had. In between stories, he'd occasionally press his hand to my forehead, ostensibly to check my temperature, but there was something in the lingering of his touch that suggested it might be about more than medical concern. Each time, our eyes would meet for just a moment longer than necessary, and each time, I'd feel that same flutter of something unnameable but undeniably present between us. As evening fell and my apartment grew dim, Alex turned on the small lamp beside my bed, casting everything in a soft, golden glow. I was feeling markedly better, whether from the soup, the company, or some combination of both. I couldn't say for sure. I should probably let you get some rest, he said eventually, gathering up the cards and stacking them neatly on my nightstand. Is there anything else you need before I go? I was surprised by how much I didn't want him to leave. The thought of returning to my solitary sickness after hours of his company felt oddly desolate. But I also knew he was right. I needed sleep, and he'd already given up his entire day to take care of me. You've done more than enough, I said sincerely. I don't know how to thank you. You could start by texting me next time you're sick, instead of suffering in noble solitude, he suggested, his tone light, but his eyes serious. Or, texting me even when you're not sick. Just because. I can probably manage that, I agreed, smiling despite the exhaustion that was rapidly overtaking me now that the excitement of his company was waning. He stood up, hesitating for a moment beside the bed. Then, in a gesture that somehow managed to be both casual and incredibly intimate, he leaned down and pressed his lips gently to my forehead. Still warm, he murmured, but definitely better. Get some sleep. I'll check on you tomorrow. And then he was gone, leaving behind a container of leftover soup in my refrigerator and a feeling in my chest that was too complex to name. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I found myself thinking about the many forms care can take. Sometimes it's grand gestures and dramatic declarations. But more often, it's the quiet, simple acts, a bowl of homemade soup, a gentle hand on a fevered forehead, the willingness to sit beside someone when they're at their most vulnerable and least appealing. I realized that perhaps I'd been looking at vulnerability all wrong. Maybe allowing someone to care for you isn't a weakness, but a different kind of strength. The strength to trust, to let down walls, to accept connection even when it feels risky. The next morning, I woke feeling significantly better. My fever had broken overnight, and though I still had a cough and a stuffy nose, the worst of the illness seemed to have passed. As promised, my phone pinged with a text from Alex. Temperature check. How's the patient this morning? I smiled as I typed my reply, something warm and hopeful expanding in my chest that had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with the person who had brought me soup when I was sick and stayed to check my temperature in more ways than one. Total _char_count, 13,874.